32-bit float seems to be all the rave right now, and Zoom is likely one of the companies responsible for this new trend, with their recorders and now the UAC-232 interface with 32-bit float recording. But do you really don't have to set your gain anymore, and is this the beginning of a new era? Let's find out. Hey, Julian Kraus here, and in this review I'll talk about my experiences with the UAC-232, have a closer look at the audio performance, and of course the 32-bit float operation, which is quite interesting in multiple ways. Full disclaimer, I bought the UAC-232 with the help of my awesome Patreons. Shout out to these absolute legends. Other than that, this video has not been sponsored in any shape or form. Let's have a look at the interface itself before we dive deeper into the audio topics. From a design point, the 232 resembles a pretty classic 2-channel audio interface in a squarish box. Two things stand out right away. First of all, the metal rods on each corner, which can be used for mounting options for the interface or help to tie down cables. One thing I've noticed though is that the rubber pads are round on these rods, and because of that the interface does not firmly sit on the desk but tends to slightly roll around from side to side. Not a huge deal, but I would have preferred this to be more stable. The second thing I noticed is the build quality. The 232 is quite light at 360 grams. That's the weight of a 3 to 4 month old hedgehog for all the Americans here, but that's because the whole housing is made out of plastic. It is still relatively robust, but it just doesn't compare to interfaces with a metal housing, like for example a Focusrite 2i2. The knobs are also plastic as well, so as a whole the interface does feel a bit on the cheaper side. The dials are smooth to turn though, so that's great. Speaking of dials, on the front you get a big output dial, which adjusts the output volume of the main outputs. The smaller dial controls the headphone volume independently. My only complaint here is that the dial is a bit close to the 1/4-inch headphone port below, and with a big head jack inserted, it can make the adjustment of the volume a bit trickier. A few more millimeters distance between the port and the dial wouldn't have hurt. On the front you can also find 4 buttons. One to turn on direct monitoring, which is quite nice, and you can even dial in the exact amount in the software, which I will get to later. 2 phantom power buttons, which individually toggle 48 volts for the mic inputs, and a button which toggles the first TRS input between a line level or a high Z guitar input. In terms of inputs, you get 2 XLR and TRS combo inputs, which can record anything from mic to line level. And if you weren't sure that this interface is capable of recording in 32-bit float, well, it always reminds you with this blue status LED, which is turned on when the interface is in 32-bit float recording mode. Switching to the back, you can find the aforementioned TRS main outputs to connect your studio monitors. There's also a set of MIDI in and output connections, a Kensington locking point, and 2 USB-C ports. One is to connect the interface to a PC, and in most situations this handles the data connection and simultaneously delivers power. But in case you use a mobile device that doesn't deliver enough power via USB, then you can power the interface with, for example, a power bank via the second port. Now, it would be a shame if somebody were to open the interface and reveal the 32-bit float magic. So I'm not going to. As you can see, the UAC-232 uses an AKM AK5534 analog to digital converter, which is actually a 4-channel converter. And here's how I think that works. This is pure speculation and I have no idea if this is totally correct, so take this with a big grain of salt. I think Zoom is capturing all 4 streams of the ADC and have the ADCs set up in pairs so that you have one as high sensitivity and one that has a low sensitivity, and then switch between them depending on the signal strength. And this is likely done by the ARM microcontroller. If that's completely over your head, you can watch my dual ADC explanation video. But in the end, all that it means is that the 232 is merging the dynamic range of 2 analog to digital converters and thus can capture a huge range of signals, which is why you don't have to set your gain anymore with this interface. It simply captures all the signals coming from the microphone, doesn't matter how soft or strong. Okay, enough about that, let's check out the audio performance, starting with the mic inputs. First up, here's the frequency response, which should be as flat as possible to record all frequencies equally well. You can see that the frequency response is very flat in the audible range, and it only rolls off at very low frequencies. But that's below the human hearing range, and that can actually help to avoid infrasonic rumble in your recordings. All good here. Next up is dynamic range, which is the ratio of the strongest signal that the interface can capture and its noise floor. And this is where it gets mighty impressive. The Zoom UAC-232 comes in at 136.5 dBA. I actually had to change the scale of my comparison chart because it never went that high. The 232 easily beats all other interfaces by an additional 14 decibels. That's pretty crazy. Of course, keep in mind that this is the result of merging the signal of two ADCs, which is obviously beating a single ADC solution. And there are definitely some downsides to the switching, which we will talk about in a second. Still, this is something that hasn't been done like this before, at least not in this price range, and I think that's very exciting. So in practice, this means that the UAC-232 can capture incredibly small but also incredibly strong signals without any need of adjusting the gain. In fact, there is no gain dial on the interface. The only thing you get is an input level slider in the mix control software. The important part here is that this is digital amplification, which only takes place after the signal has already been captured. There is no analog gain control on this interface. A positive thing I want to mention here is that Zoom seems to have done their homework, as I've done multiple tests with specifically created test signals which forced the ADC to toggle between the high and low range, and I could not hear any artifacts in the transition. That's great because in normal use I do not expect the switching between the ADCs to be audible. I mean, that's what you would expect, but nevertheless, it's great to see that this holds true in practice. One downside of the switching behavior is that any signal in the ADC's frequency range seems to toggle the switching once it surpasses a certain threshold. This means that theoretically a strong signal in the ultrasonic range could cause the ADC to toggle to the lower sensitivity one, which would negatively impact the signal-to-noise ratio in the audible range. This is a very rare scenario, but I would have wished that signals that are above half the sample rate would not be able to toggle the switching of the ADCs. Additionally, some ADCs tend to have a rise in the ultrasonic noise, and this also holds true for the 232. When the ADC switches ranges, the noise rises noticeably in the ultrasonic range, and this noise modulation might become audible when you pitch down ultrasonic frequencies into the audible range. Again, this is definitely more of an edge case, but for recording ultrasonic stuff, the 232 might not necessarily be the best option. Notice that I haven't mentioned the 32-bit float mode so far, and in fact the incredibly huge dynamic range of the 232 can still be fully contained in 24 bits. So you might ask yourself the question, what's the benefit of 32-bit float then? It has to do with how the signal is stored. Historically, 16 and 24-bit integer formats don't support values above 0 dBFS, so they clip the signal, while 32-bit float retains this information. If you turn up the input level in the mix control, the signal you record gets amplified, and here is the point where you can clip when using 24-bit mode. So that's where you still have to be careful to set your input level properly to not clip. If you're in 32-bit float, this does not matter, because even if the signal goes above 0 dBFS, you can still pull it down in post. So even in 24-bit mode, you benefit from the dual ADC setup and the huge dynamic range, and theoretically you could just leave your input level at 0 and then set your level in post. With a 32-bit float, you have the additional benefit that you can bring the signal level up to a typical recording level, and even if it were to clip, you can simply restore it. But there's a big catch. In my testing I found that the 32-bit float was only fully functional with the ASIO driver on Windows, and I think this is important to mention because the interface shows a nice 32-bit float indicator, you could still be clipping in an application where you can't recover the audio. OBS and Discord are still clipped at 0 dBFS. Maybe there will be a future update, but at the time of making this video, 32-bit float did not prevent clipping in these applications. So the best thing to do is actually to make a quick test of clipping and then pulling down the signal to see if you can restore it. I am not an Apple user, so I can only tell you about Windows, but it seems that at the point of making this review, there is no application that supports a 32-bit float via the standard MME or Wasapi driver. When I was using ASIO, the 32-bit float worked fine with, for example, Adobe Audition, but without ASIO, for example in Audition, the audio was not recoverable when going above 0 dBFS, despite being in the 32-bit float mode on the UAC-232. I think there's a very good chance that this will be updated in the future, and I imagine that there will be more and more 32-bit float adoption, but you have to be aware that depending on the application you use and also on the driver, 32-bit float might or might not always work as intended. You have been warned. Zoom actually has a table showing different software and indicating whether it supports 32-bit float recording and if the audio above 0 dBFS is recoverable. I think they should also mention the driver there because, as I mentioned before, it can make a difference if you use ASIO on Windows or the Windows standard driver. If ASIO is available, that's definitely the preferred option, not only because of the 32-bit float. What would be really cool is if there were a 24-bit limiter mode, which would behave like a normal 24-bit interface, but when you go above 0 dBFS, the interface deploys a digital limiter to keep the signal in range. This way you could use the interface like any other and with all applications, but make use of the incredibly high dynamic range to prevent clipping. That would be really useful in, for example, streaming situations where you want your signal to sit at a decent level, but you also do not want to blow out people's ears when you suddenly get a bit louder. Zoom, if you're watching, you know what you have to do. I know the whole 32-bit float thing can be a bit confusing, but in one of my next videos I will explain it in more detail and you'll see that it is quite easy to understand. Subscribe if you don't want to miss that video. Besides dynamic range, the preamp performance is quite important, especially if you use dynamic microphones. As an example for a worst case scenario, here I have connected the infamously low sensitivity Shure SM7B directly to the UAC-232, and I'll be quiet for a second so you can have a listen to the noise floor of this setup. Great to hear that this is a pretty low noise floor. I was a bit afraid as the last two Zoom interfaces I reviewed didn't fare too well in this test, but the UAC-232 has a very respectable preamp noise of -128.3 dBA weighted, which is right in line with other interfaces in its price range. Have a listen. The preamp noise of the 232 is definitely low enough that you do not need an additional inline preamp, and because the input level slider can provide you with an additional 60 decibels of amplification, you will have no problem bringing even low sensitive mics up to a proper recording level. Lastly, here's the distortion graph with a typical mic signal, and you can see exactly where the 232 switches ADC ranges. Generally, we see a downwards trend, which is exactly what we would like to see. And only an inaudible amount of distortion is creeping in just before the input clips. But Julian, the 232 cannot clip. Wrong. At some point even the 232 will clip. This point is so high that under normal circumstances you will never hit this level, but technically the input can and will clip at some point. Now I don't want to bore you with the line level input performance because it is very similar to the mic inputs. The frequency response is very flat. There is only an ever so slight hump around 25 Hz, but this is really not something you can hear. The THD+N looks quite special. Once again, you can see where the interface switches between the ADCs, but on average distortions are at or below -80 decibels, and this should be inaudible. The dynamic range is slightly lower compared to the mic inputs, but still higher than anything else I've ever measured before. All in all, no surprises here. Before we check out the software, let me quickly show you the performance of the main output and the headphone output. The frequency response of the main output is perfectly flat in the audible range, so that's great. The dynamic range of the output is quite good with about 113 dBA, but it didn't quite make it into the excellent category. Still, I would say that for the most part this is very good and you shouldn't hear any noise from your studio monitors with this interface. The distortion performance is decent. I have definitely seen better ones, but you can see where the line levels out that distortion components sit -90 decibels below the test signal, which in my opinion is not audible. Also nice to see that the 232 delivers quite a nice signal strength of about 16 dBV, which should bring any studio monitor to a very loud level. As always, I have made multiple measurements of the headphone output, and you can compare them all here in this colorful mess. I'm not going to go through all of the measurements, but let's have a look at the ones that stick out. While not directly apparent from these numbers, you can see that the frequency response of the headphone output depends quite a bit on the impedance of the headphones. With low impedance headphones, the roll-off in the lower frequencies is quite a bit more pronounced, and while I don't think that this is extremely apparent on playback, it could have definitely been more flat and less dependent on the headphone's impedance. Additionally, the output impedance is on the higher side. That means that the frequency response of your headphones could change even more depending on their impedance. Because of that, I would avoid using very low impedance headphones or IEMs with 16 ohms or so, and would go at least with 32 ohms and higher if sound accuracy is important for you. Besides that, the headphone output has quite a bit of power and you should be able to drive most headphones to loud listening levels. THD and noise levels are also quite good and you shouldn't perceive any noise or distortion with the headphone output. All in all, not a high-end performance, but definitely a decent headphone output quality, especially if you use high impedance headphones. As promised, let's check out the software that comes with the UAC-232 because it is pretty much mandatory to use to get the most out of the interface. First up, here's the driver control panel, which gives you access to the buffer size, sample rate and format. The latter one is where you can switch between 24-bit or 32-bit float operation. This is straightforward, but to get the full functionality of the 232, you also need to install mix control. Here you can set the aforementioned input level and you also have a waveform preview, which gives you a very basic glimpse of what you're recording. The software also provides loopback, which allows you to record the audio that is outputted by the interface in addition to the inputs. Then there's a switch which toggles between music and streaming mode. In music mode, the inputs are recorded as separate tracks and you can individually set the level of direct monitoring for each channel and pan with the knobs above. Streaming mode combines the left and right channel into one mix, and with the dials you can now control how much of each channel contributes to the overall mix. This can also be useful in communication software, which doesn't see the second input of the interface in music mode, but if you're in streaming mode, both inputs get sent to the software and can be heard by other people. Last but not least, you also have a level meter for your outputs, which you can use to gauge your output level that you're listening to. I think the mix control is quite a useful tool, but it does of course not provide more elaborate mixing or routing functionality like in bigger interfaces. Then again, with a 2-channel interface, that's probably not often needed. I also checked the round-trip latency, which is specifically interesting for people who want to monitor their audio in real time with effects applied. Here you can see the RTL with 48 kHz and different buffer sizes. It's definitely not the worst, but it's also not the best times I've measured. When you record with a higher sample rate, the RTLs get slightly better and even more competitive, although it could still have been a bit better. I think the RTL performance is acceptable, but nothing special. Alright, verdict time. Is this the future of audio recording? Do you just plug in your microphone and never have to worry about gain again? Well, kind of, but we're not quite there yet. The UAC-232 does pretty much what Zoom is advertising, and that's recording an insane dynamic range which pretty much captures all the audio from your microphone, and because of that there is really no need to set the gain anymore. And with the 32-bit float recording mode, you can recover audio that has been clipped in software. Now the issue is that 32-bit float is not universally supported by all software. It is of course not the fault of the interface, but you have to keep in mind that at the point of making this video, we are still in a relatively early stage of 32-bit float, at least when it comes to it as a recording format. And the reality is that there is a lot of software and driver combinations that don't fully work with a 32-bit float yet. Some programs might not work with 32-bit float at all, while other programs let you record in it, but then don't retain the audio information above 0 dBFS, which can lead to a very unpleasant surprise. So if you plan to use the interface in 32-bit float, I highly recommend that you make a test first where you clip on purpose and then see if you can recover the audio, just to make sure that everything works. On Windows, use ASIO wherever you can, because this seems to work most reliably with 32-bit float. When it works, the 32-bit float recording is a pretty handy thing to have. You essentially record like always, but you have the possibility to restore your signal if you ever go above 0 dBFS. So there are definitely still some quirks that have to be ironed out before I can confidently recommend 32-bit float interfaces. That said, the UAC-232 still benefits from its dual ADC conversion, and if you set it to the 24-bit mode, you can still capture an insanely huge dynamic range, and that's already supported in pretty much any audio software today. Just be aware that if you buy this mainly as a 24-bit interface, it does not have any gain dials, and you will need to either set your recording level in the mix control software, or you will have to amplify the recording to the desired volume in post. Besides the dual ADC and a 32-bit float, the UAC-232 overall delivers a decent audio performance, similar to other interfaces in its price range. The preamps are very low noise, the dynamic range of the outputs is good, only the headphone output impedance could have been a bit better, and the build quality a bit less plasticky. Okay, that's it for now. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more content, and I will see you all in the next one.